The chair scraped back from the table with a sound like a gunshot, and every soul in the Silver Spur Saloon in Redemption, Texas, went perfectly still. Elvira Ramsey stood at the center of the room with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth, her dark eyes fixed on the broad-shouldered man who had just risen from the corner table, the table with two chairs, where one chair had sat conspicuously empty for as long as anyone in town could remember. Jedediah Malone was looking at her, the way a man looks at something he has been afraid to want for a very long time, the way a man looks when wanting something has become more dangerous than a loaded pistol pressed to his sternum. The room smelled of whiskey and sawdust, and the faint iron tang of summer heat rolling in through the batwing doors. Outside, the year was 1878, and the town of Redemption, Texas, was aptly named for reasons most of its residents understood far too personally. "I have been watching that empty chair," he said, his voice low and unhurried the way a deep river is unhurried, carrying more beneath its surface than the eye could ever see, "and I think it has always belonged to you." The words landed on Elvira like a hand placed gently over a wound she had forgotten was still bleeding. She should have turned and walked out. Every instinct born from 3 years of hiding, 3 years of reinventing herself piece by careful piece, 3 years of keeping the dark past that followed her like a shadow sealed behind the locked door of her composure. Every single one of those instincts told her to go. Instead, she stood there, and the terrible, beautiful, forbidden thing she had been fighting since the moment she first saw Jedediah Malone sitting at that corner table 6 weeks ago rose up in her chest like floodwater. She pulled out the chair and sat down. That was how it ended, or rather that was how it truly began. 6 weeks earlier, Elvira Ramsey had arrived in Redemption, Texas, on the midday stage from San Antonio with $37, a carpetbag containing everything she owned, and a secret that could get her killed. The stage had lurched to a stop in front of the Redemption Express office on Main Street, and she had stepped out into the August heat with the composed, unhurried manner of a woman who had learned that composure was the only armor poor women could afford. She was 26 years old, dark-haired and dark-eyed, lean from months of eating worry instead of food, wearing a traveling dress of dusty blue wool that had seen better days and carrying herself as though it were silk. Redemption was a cattle town, prosperous enough to have a proper main street with a bank, a general store, a barber, a doctor's office, a church, and the Silver Spur Saloon, which doubled as the town's social center, its gossip mill, and its unofficial courthouse. It had a sheriff named Harold Briggs who was 60 years old and moved like his joints were filled with gravel. It had a newspaper called the Redemption Gazette, edited by a fierce little woman named Clara Hutchins who had ink permanently stained into the creases of her knuckles. It had all the hallmarks of a town trying very hard to be civilized, which meant it had all the cracks and shadows that civilization always tries to paper over. Elvira had been directed to the boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Aldian, a round, practical woman who charged $2 a week for room and board, and asked no questions beyond whether you intended to pay on time. Elvira had paid the first 2 weeks in advance from her $37, and had spent the evening sitting at the small window of her room watching the street below, calculating how long she had before the man she was running from traced her here. His name was Doyle Renfrew, and he was not a man who forgave women who testified against his business partners and then disappeared before he could make them sorry for it. He was not a man who forgot faces. He was, in the language of San Antonio's law-abiding community, a businessman and a rancher of considerable reputation. He was, in the language of the people who actually knew him, dangerous in the particular way that men are dangerous when they have enough money to make their cruelty legal. Elvira had worked as a bookkeeper for a land agent named Silas Prout in San Antonio. She had discovered, in the course of doing her job with the thoroughness she always applied to everything, that Silas Prout had been defrauding homesteaders, Many of them recently freed black families who had scraped together everything they had to file legal claims on parcels of land under the Homestead Act of 1862. By filing fraudulent counterclaims on their behalf of Doyle Renfrew, who then acquired the land for himself. The scheme had been elegant in its cruelty. The homesteaders would arrive to find their paperwork mysteriously lost, their claims contested by a man with more lawyers than they had dollars, their futures stripped away with the polished machinery of paperwork and intimidation. Elvira had gathered the evidence. She had testified before the federal land commissioner in San Antonio. Silas Pruitt had gone to jail. The fraud had been partially unwound, not entirely, not as much as justice required, because justice in 1878 Texas had its limits, but some of those families had gotten their land back. Elvira had done the right thing. And then Doyle Renfrew, who had powerful friends and a very long memory, had made it unmistakably clear through 3 separate intermediaries that doing the right thing was going to cost her considerably. She had run. She was not proud of it, but she was alive, and alive was what she needed to be in order to figure out what to do next. She had arrived in redemption with the intention of keeping her head down, finding work as a bookkeeper or seamstress or anything that paid, and staying invisible until she could figure out a longer-term plan. She had not arrived with the intention of falling in love with anyone. She had not arrived with any intention that involved Jedediah Malone. She had first seen him on her 3rd day in redemption. She had gone into the Silver Spur, not to drink, simply because Mrs. Aldian had mentioned it was the place to inquire about work in the mornings before the drinking crowd arrived, and he had been at his corner table, eating breakfast alone, a cup of coffee at his right hand and a copy of the Redemption Gazette open in front of him. He was not exceptionally tall, but he carried himself like a man who had made peace with his own dimensions, broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, even though he could not have been much older than 32 or 33. His face was the kind of face that had been outdoors a long time weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes, but it was also unexpectedly thoughtful, with a quality of stillness that Elvira had associated, in her experience, with either very dangerous men or very honest ones. She had asked the barkeep, a cheerful young man named Pete, about work. Pete had given her the names of 3 establishments that might need a bookkeeper, and had mentioned, without her asking, that Jedediah Malone over there was the best cattle rancher in the county and an honorable man, if that was useful information. Elvira had said she was sure it was very useful and had left without looking at Jedediah Malone again. She had, however, thought about him rather more than was strategic. She found work with Archibald Fenner, who ran the general store and had the most catastrophically disorganized accounts she had ever encountered. He was a good-natured man who was simply constitutionally incapable of keeping a ledger, and he paid Elvira $4 a week to turn his chaos into order, which she did with efficient satisfaction. She established herself. She made careful, friendly but not close acquaintances. She sent no letters to anyone in San Antonio. She read the newspapers from every city she could find, looking for any mention of Doyle Renfrew, watching for any sign that his reach was extending northward toward her. And every morning that she went to the Silver Spur for coffee before going to work at Fenner's store, because Mrs. Aldian's coffee was the color of dishwater, and nearly the same flavor Jedediah Malone was at his corner table, and that second chair was empty. She noticed it the second time she came in. She was curious enough about it by the 4th time to ask Pete. Pete had looked at the chair with an expression that was half fond and half something more complicated, and had said that Mr. Malone always sat at that table alone and had for going on 4 years now, and that the chair had simply always been there, unoccupied, waiting for something that Pete had never been able to identify. She had not asked any further questions, because asking further questions about a man she was actively trying not to think about seemed counterproductive. But she had kept noticing. The chair was always there. Jedediah Malone was always there, reading his newspaper or speaking quietly with the ranchers who came in to talk cattle prices, always with that quality of settled self-containment that she found increasingly difficult to ignore. He was not a man who performed himself for the room. He was simply present in whatever he was doing, with a kind of focused gravity that she found, and this was the word she came back to repeatedly and unhappily: comforting. She did not need comfort from a man she did not know. She needed invisibility and a plan. The complication arrived on a Tuesday morning in the third week of September, when she came into the Silver Spur, and found that every table was occupied except the corner one, except that only one chair was available at the corner table, because a large man named Holt, who worked at the livery, had taken the other chair to a neighboring table to accommodate some overflow from a rancher's breakfast meeting. The only remaining seat in the establishment was the empty chair at Jedediah Malone's table. She had almost left. The coffee was truly terrible at the boarding house. She had stood at the door for a moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was, and then she had walked to the corner table and said, with the carefully modulated courtesy she applied to all social situations, "I beg your pardon. Is this chair taken?" Jedediah Malone had looked up from his newspaper. His eyes were a shade of gray-green that she had not anticipated being as significant as it was. He had looked at her, not with the lazy appraisal that she was accustomed to receiving from men in saloons, but with a directness that was different in quality, as though he were genuinely interested in seeing her rather than simply looking at her, and he had said, "No, ma'am, please." She had sat down. Pete had brought her coffee without being asked, which meant she had been coming in often enough that her order was known, which was a small and pleasant thing. She had opened the book she had brought, an 1876 edition of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she was rereading for the third time, and she had read, and he had read his newspaper, and they had sat in the kind of silence that ought to have been unremarkable and was somehow anything but. He had introduced himself when she stood to leave. "Jedediah Malone," he had said, rising as she rose, with a courtesy that she noted was reflexive rather than performed. "I run the Double M spread about 8 miles east of town. Elvira Ramsey," she had said. "I keep books for Archibald Fenner. Fenner's lucky," he had said. "His accounts were a disaster before you came." She had raised an eyebrow. "You know his accounts. He complained about them loudly and publicly for 2 years before you arrived. The whole town knows." He had smiled then, just briefly, a contained and genuine smile that did something unhelpful to her composure. "Welcome to redemption, Miss Ramsey." She had left telling herself it meant nothing. The following morning, she had come in to find the chair at his table waiting, freshly positioned as though someone had restored it to its rightful place, and Jedediah Malone had looked up when she came through the batwing doors with an expression so carefully neutral that it was, to anyone paying close attention, not neutral at all. She had sat down. They had not spoken much. It had felt, and this was the part that frightened her, entirely natural. This became the pattern of their mornings. She arrived. She sat. They read in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging observations about the newspaper or the weather or the state of Main Street, which was perpetually in need of either repair or an entirely different approach to drainage. He was funny in the way that genuinely intelligent people are funny, dry and unexpected, finding the absurdity in things rather than manufacturing it. She found herself responding with her own humor, the sharp wit she generally kept carefully sheathed because sharp women in 1878 made men nervous, and she could not afford to make anyone nervous. With Jedediah, she forgot to be careful about that. She forgot several things she was supposed to remember when she was with him. She learned in fragments and increments because he was not a man who volunteered his history all at once about the shape of his life. He had come to Texas from Missouri in 1869. At 23, with enough money to buy a small parcel of land and the willingness to work the kind of hours that most men considered unreasonable. The Double M spread was now 1,500 acres of good cattle country, with 30 head of horses and more cattle than she could keep track of, and he ran it with 6 hired hands and a foreman named Cal who had been with him since the beginning. He sat on the town council. He subscribed to 2 newspapers and ordered books from a catalog out of New York. He had a dog named Ptolemy who was allegedly a cattle dog but was, by his own admission, primarily interested in sleeping on the porch. He had been engaged once to a woman named Sarah Brennan, who had died of a fever in the spring of 1874. He mentioned this once, quietly, not as a wound being displayed but as a fact being shared, and the way he said it with a grief that had aged into something that did not require comfort but simply acknowledgement, told her more about the quality of his heart than anything else he had ever said. The empty chair, she understood then, was not about Sarah. It was something else. It was about a man who had closed off a part of himself and was not sure how to open it again, or whether he should. She understood this in a way that was perhaps more personal than was wise. She was falling in love with him. She recognized it with the same clear-eyed precision that she applied to Archibald Fenner's accounts, identified, categorized, understood in its implications. She was falling in love with Jedediah Malone, and it was the most strategically disastrous thing she had done since testifying before the Federal Land Commissioner, and she could not stop. She could not tell him the truth about herself. She could not tell him about Doyle Renfrew, about the testimony, about the dark past that followed her like a second shadow. To tell him was to involve him in a danger she had no right to ask him to share, and more than that, to tell him was to make herself real to him in a way that could be taken away, and she did not think she could survive another loss of that particular variety. She told herself this. She believed it with the conviction of a woman who had been making excellent, reasonable arguments for doing the wrong thing for several weeks. In the meantime, she sat across from him every morning and laughed at his dry observations about the Redemption Town Council, and argued with him about whether George Eliot or Charles Dickens was the superior novelist. He preferred Dickens, which she considered evidence of a blind spot in an otherwise excellent mind, and felt herself becoming, bit by bit, irreversibly, someone who had a reason to stay in redemption beyond simple survival. The trap she had been afraid of since arriving finally closed on an afternoon in early October, when she was leaving Fenner's store after a long day of reconciling invoices, and she nearly walked directly into a man named Cord Garvey. She had known Cord Garvey in San Antonio. He had worked for Doyle Renfrew as a finder, which was to say, he found people who Renfrew wanted found and delivered information about their whereabouts. He was a thin man with a forgettable face and excellent instincts, and when he saw her on the boardwalk outside Fenner's store, the recognition in his eyes was instantaneous and devastating. She kept walking. She did not run. Running would confirm it, and Cord Garvey was the kind of man who filed information away rather than acting on it immediately, who went back to his employer before he made a move. She walked back to the boarding house with her pulse hammering and her face composed and her mind moving at the speed of necessity. She had 2 days, maybe 3, before Renfrew knew where she was. She had to decide what to do. The options were the same ones she had been cycling through since San Antonio, and none of them were good. Run again, go to the law, or find some third way she had not yet thought of. She sat in her room at Mrs. Aldian's boarding house and stared at the wall and thought about the morning's conversation with Jedediah, in which he had told her, with a careful casualness that was not casual at all, that the ranch's winter preparedness work was almost done, and he expected the next few months would be considerably quieter, and that he had been thinking it might be a fine time to host a small dinner at the Double M, if she would consider attending. He had asked this in the manner of a man who had thought carefully about how to phrase the question, and had nevertheless delivered it with more vulnerability than he had intended, and she had said yes before her better judgment could intervene. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the dark past she was carrying and the danger it represented, and the fundamental unfairness of the position she was in, not a position of her own making, but one created by a powerful man's desire for revenge against a woman who had simply done the right thing. Then she stopped thinking about fairness and started thinking about strategy. The next morning, she went to the Silver Spur. She sat in the chair. Jedediah was already there, and he looked up when she came in with that expression. She had learned to read the one that meant he had been waiting without admitting he was waiting. And she sat down and looked at him across the small table and made a decision that terrified her in its completeness. She told him everything. She did not plan to. She had planned to say nothing, to perhaps find a reason to leave town before the dinner and write him a careful, distant note. Instead, she looked at his face, that weathered, thoughtful, trustworthy face, and every argument for silence collapsed. She told him about San Antonio, about Silas Prout and the fraudulent land claims and the homesteaders who had been robbed. She told him about Doyle Renfrew and about the testimony and about running. She told him she had seen Cord Garvey on the street and she had perhaps 2 days before Renfrew knew where she was. She told him all of it in a steady, quiet voice, watching his face as she did. His expression did not change dramatically. It moved through several things: attention, concern, a deepening gravity, and something that might have been anger, though it was not directed at her. And at the end of it he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and then he said, "Does Sheriff Briggs know any of this?" "No," she said. "We should tell him today," Jedediah said, in the tone of a man organizing a response to a problem, not a man distancing himself from it. "And I know Judge Harlan in Fort Worth who handles federal land cases. He has jurisdiction on this. Renfrew's reach doesn't extend to federal court, Elvira." She stared at him. She had braced for something else, for the reasonable, careful withdrawal of a man who had not signed up for other people's dangerous secrets. She had not braced for this. "This is not your problem," she said. He looked at her directly with those gray-green eyes, and there was nothing evasive in them, nothing performed. "You sat in that chair," he said quietly. "I'm making it my problem." This was the moment she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was entirely and irreversibly lost. They went to see Sheriff Briggs together that afternoon. Briggs listened with the thorough attention of a man who had been a lawman long enough to know that the most important part of being a lawman was actually listening. And when she had finished, he sat back in his chair behind the battered desk in his office and said, "I know Cord Garvey by reputation. He's a weasel, but he's not a killer." He paused. "Renfrew is a different kind of problem. The federal angle is the angle to press," Jedediah said. "The land fraud involved federal homestead filings. That's not state jurisdiction." Briggs nodded slowly. He looked at Elvira. "You willing to testify again if it comes to it?" "I've already testified once," she said. "I kept copies of everything I submitted to the land commissioner. I have them with me." Briggs looked at her for a moment with something that might have been admiration. "Where?" She had smiled slightly. "In my carpetbag under a false bottom. I'm not an amateur, Sheriff." Jedediah made a sound that was almost a laugh and turned it quickly into a cough, and she caught his eye briefly and felt something warm and entirely involuntary move through her chest. Briggs sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in Dallas that afternoon. He also, on his own initiative, sent a separate message to Judge Harlan in Fort Worth, with whom Jedediah had already sent a personal letter via the afternoon stage. In the meantime, there was the question of Cord Garvey and what he would do once he reported back to Renfrew. Jedediah proposed that Elvira stay at the Double M Ranch while things were in motion, not as a hidden person, but openly as a guest, because he had hands and a foreman and the ranch was more defensible than the boarding house. Elvira had argued against this for approximately 5 minutes before the logic overcame her objections. She packed her carpetbag, the false bottom intact. The document safe said goodbye to a briefly tearful Mrs. Aldian, who extracted a promise from Elvira to come back for Sunday dinner as soon as the whole business was resolved, and rode out to the Double M with Jedediah on a late October afternoon under a sky the color of hammered copper. The ranch was not what she had expected, though she was not sure exactly what she had expected. It was substantial and well-ordered, with a main house built of good timber and a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning, and corrals and outbuildings arranged with the practical logic of a man who had thought carefully about how things should work. There were cottonwood trees near the creek that ran through the southern pasture, their leaves going yellow in the autumn, and the grass in the paddocks was golden and dry and beautiful in the low afternoon light. Ptolemy, the dog, came off the porch to investigate and immediately decided that Elvira was acceptable, positioning himself at her feet with the decisive loyalty of a dog who had made a permanent judgment. She found this touching in a way that made Jedediah smile with a fullness she had not seen from him before. The foreman Cal was a compact, efficient man in his late 40s who had, Elvira suspected, seen approximately everything the West had to offer and processed all of it into a bedrock equanimity that nothing could disturb. He greeted her with polite reserve, assessed her in one quick look, and said to Jedediah, "The south room is aired out. I had Rosa put clean linens on." This said everything about how much Cal had intuited about the situation, and the fact that he had prepared the room before being asked told Elvira that he approved, which she found she cared about more than was perhaps rational. Rosa was the cook, a broad-shouldered Mexican woman of 50 who had been cooking at the Double M since Jedediah bought it and who treated him with the combination of exasperation and fierce loyalty that one typically reserves for family. She fed Elvira an enormous dinner without being asked and told her, in the direct manner of a woman who did not have time for indirection, that she was the first woman to sit at this table since Mr. Malone had taken ownership of it, and that it was about time. Jedediah had looked at his plate during this speech and said nothing, which told Elvira a great deal. She lay in the south room that night listening to the quiet sounds of a working ranch and the distant call of a coyote somewhere on the flats, and she felt something she had not felt in months, temporarily, imperfectly, provisionally safe. Not because the danger had passed, it had not, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. The days that followed were both the strangest and the most unexpectedly beautiful of her life. The ranch operated on its own rhythm, and she fell into it with a naturalness that surprised her. She helped Rosa with the kitchen accounts, which were tangled in a different but equally interesting way from Fenner's store accounts, and Rosa tolerated her presence with gradually increasing warmth, which felt like a significant achievement. She read on the porch in the mornings. She walked the southern pasture with Ptolemy, who was an excellent walking companion because he required no conversation and was perfectly willing to sit quietly beside her when she stopped to think. She learned the names of the horses, which took several days because there were many horses and several of them were not inclined to make themselves memorable by standing out from the herd. And she spent time with Jedediah. Long evenings on the porch after dinner, watching the sky do its extraordinary Texas things, the sunsets that went on for an hour in shades of orange and rose, and the purple that looked too dramatic to be real, the stars that appeared in such numbers that she always felt slightly humbled by them. He had a guitar that he played with quiet competence in the evenings, nothing showy, just simple songs that had the quality of things that had been handed down through generations, and the sound of it in the cooling evening air was one of the loveliest things she had encountered in some time. They talked. Properly, deeply, the kind of conversation that happens when two people who have both been somewhat isolated discover that they have been waiting for exactly this quality of exchange. She told him about growing up in Virginia, about her father who had been a school teacher and had given her a love of books and a habit of precision thinking, about her mother who had died when she was 14, and how the loss had reshaped her in ways she was still identifying. She told him about moving to San Antonio at 22 after her father died, about the work with Silas Prout, about the growing understanding of what was being done, and the decision to do something about it. "Were you afraid?" he asked. It was not a challenging question, but a genuinely curious one. "Terrified," she said honestly. "But I had seen the faces of those families. I had their paperwork in front of me. I had seen the applications, the stories behind each parcel of land, a family that had been enslaved for 3 generations trying to build something real, and a man taking it away with forged papers and a bought lawyer. I couldn't unknow it." She paused. "I think moral knowledge is like that. Once you see an injustice clearly, pretending you don't see it costs more than acting on it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark outline of the hills against the stars. "The land commissioner unwound some of those claims," he said. "You said not all. What happened to the rest?" "Some families had already lost too much time and money to contest it further. Some took settlements that were less than what they deserved. One family, the Carters, they had a daughter about my age, they got their land back." She stopped. "I keep thinking about them, whether they're managing, whether the land is working for them. I sent a letter after I left San Antonio to the commissioner's office, asking them to watch those parcels. I don't know if it did any good." Jedediah turned his head to look at her. "It probably did. Persistent paper trails make corrupt men nervous." "Is that experience speaking?" "The town council tried to rezone the water rights on the creek that runs through my southern pasture last year," he said dryly. 3 of the 5 members had invested in the competing proposal. I submitted 17 formal objections with documentation. They tabled the rezoning and 2 of the members did not run for re-election." He paused. "Paper and persistence, Miss Ramsey, almost always more effective than guns." She laughed, and the sound of it surprised her slightly with its fullness, and she noticed that he was watching her laugh with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt it like a hand placed over her heart. "Elvira," she said, because they had been calling each other by first names for days in the evening conversations, but she had not made it explicit before, and it felt important to be explicit. "You should call me Elvira, at least when we are not in company." "We're not in company," he said, and there was something in his voice, that same contained quality as the smile, the thing that only emerged when he had stopped managing it, that made the sentence carry considerably more weight than the words themselves. "No," she agreed, "we're not." The response from Dallas came 8 days after the telegram. A federal marshal named Augustin Reyes, a serious-faced man of 40 with a reputation that preceded him through 3 states, arrived in Redemption on the morning stage with 2 deputies and an extraordinary amount of authoritative paperwork. He met with Sheriff Briggs first, then with Elvira, and spent 2 hours reviewing the documents from her carpetbag's false bottom with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in building a case. "These are exceptionally well organized," he said, looking at her over the documents with something that might have been surprise before he reorganized his expression. "I was a bookkeeper," she said. "Right," he said. "I've been doing this for 16 years, Miss Ramsey, and I will tell you that the documentation you are providing is better than most of what I receive from trained investigators." He set down the papers. "Doyle Renfrew has been a person of interest at the federal level for 2 years. Your testimony and these records are what makes a charge stick rather than slide." She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was still tight. "Will he be charged?" "If I have anything to say about it, yes." Marshal Reyes paused. "I will tell you honestly that the legal process will take time. These things move slowly. I can guarantee that Cord Garvey will be dealt with. He's operating as an agent of intimidation, which is a federal crime under the circumstances. Renfrew himself will need a grand jury, and that won't be convened overnight." He looked at her steadily. "You'll need to be patient." "I have been patient for 3 years," she said. "A little longer then," he said, not unkindly. Cord Garvey was located, confronted, and found to be very willing to cooperate with federal authorities when presented with the alternative, which Marshal Reyes laid out with quiet specificity in the sheriff's office, while Garvey went progressively paler. Garvey gave them everything he had, not just about Elvira, but about Renfrew's broader operations, the names of other finders, the communication chain, the additional fraud schemes that had nothing to do with land but were no less damaging for that. It turned out that Cord Garvey had been quietly accumulating information about his employer as insurance for years, which was either very clever or very short-sighted depending on how things developed. And in this case, it turned out to be very useful. Marshal Reyes left for Dallas with his deputies, and with more documentation than he had arrived with, promising to return when the grand jury proceedings were underway, and Elvira's formal testimony was required. Cord Garvey was held in Redemption's jail, not as a prisoner exactly, but as a material witness in protective custody, which Sheriff Briggs handled with the pragmatic hospitality of a man who knew that a cooperative witness required good coffee. Elvira, with no immediate threat pressing and a grand jury process that would take months to reach her, found herself in the interesting position of having run as far as she needed to run and arrived, unexpectedly, somewhere she might want to stay. She went back to Fenner's store. She continued her mornings at the Silver Spur. She sat in the chair at Jedediah's table, which no one in the establishment had once attempted to occupy since the morning after she had first sat there, as though it had been informally declared unavailable by some consensus that nobody had formally articulated. What had changed was the quality of the space between them. Before, they had been two people being carefully careful with each other, maintaining the polite and pleasant distance of people who were not yet admitting what was happening. Now there was something more open in it, or rather, more porous, as though the walls had not come down exactly, but had developed significant gaps through which things that had been carefully managed were now moving freely in both directions. He touched her hand once, when she was showing him a passage in her book that she thought he would appreciate, and the touch lasted approximately 2 seconds and left her unable to think about Middlemark for the remainder of the morning. She caught herself watching his hands when he was not looking, the particular way he held a coffee cup, the gesture he made when he was thinking hard about something, a slight tilt of the head, a narrowing of those gray-green eyes. He called her Elvira now in company, too, and the sound of it in his voice had a quality she could not have fully explained, but which made Clara Hutchins at the neighboring table look up from her newspaper with a small, knowing smile that she did not bother to hide. In early November, she attended the dinner at the Double M that had first been proposed before everything had shifted. It was a proper dinner this time, with Cal and his wife Me, and the Hendersons from the neighboring ranch, and Clara Hutchins, who had apparently been invited by someone aware that she would be an excellent addition to any table conversation. And Rosa had made something extraordinary involving beef and chilies that made everyone silent for 30 seconds before the conversation resumed louder and more enthusiastically than before. Jedediah sat at the head of the table, and Elvira sat to his right, and the way the table was arranged, and the way the evening light came through the windows, and the way he turned to her at intervals throughout the meal, not for the benefit of the company, but simply because she was there, and he wanted to make the evening feel like something she would keep. After the guests had gone and Rosa and Me had dealt with the kitchen in the friendly, efficient way of women who have worked together for a long time, Elvira sat on the porch with Ptolemy at her feet and Jedediah beside her in the cold November dark, and the stars were extraordinary and the silence between them was the kind that does not require filling. "This house is quiet," he said eventually, not complaining, observing. "All houses are quiet," she said, "when it's just one person." "I have been thinking about that." She waited. "I have been thinking about it for a while, actually." He turned to look at her, and she could see his face in the faint light from the house window, and there was the same quality she had seen on the porch weeks ago, the openness, the absence of management. Since before the Renfrew business, since the mornings, her heart was doing something complicated. "The mornings," she repeated. "That chair," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was careful in a different way from his usual carefulness. Careful the way a man is careful when he is saying something true and important, and is determined to say it accurately. I have been watching that empty chair for a long time, Elvira. And I think I know that it has always belonged to you." The words settled over her like the first warm day after a long winter, like something she had not known she was waiting for until the moment it arrived. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about dark pasts and hidden motives and secrets and the various reasonable arguments for caution that she had been making to herself for 2 months. She thought about the fact that she had told him everything, and he had responded not with withdrawal but with presence. She thought about Ptolemy asleep on her feet and Rosa's dinner, and the way he played the guitar in the evenings, and the sound of her own full laugh that had surprised her. She reached across the small distance between the porch chairs and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately and completely, with the kind of certainty that does not second-guess itself. "I know it," she said quietly. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such deliberate and old-fashioned tenderness that she felt her throat tighten with it. "Then stay," he said. "Jedediah," she said, half laughing and half something much more serious, "I don't think I could leave if I tried." The winter of 1878 into 1879 in Redemption, Texas, was cold and long and the most genuinely contented period of Elvira Ramsey's adult life. She kept her room at Mrs. Aldion's boarding house through December for the sake of appearances that neither she nor Jedediah was particularly concerned about, but that the more conventional members of Redemption Society would have found important. And then in January she moved, at Mrs. Aldion's own suggestion, delivered with great practicality over Sunday dinner, to a proper arrangement that involved a ring. Jedediah had produced the ring 3 days after Mrs. Aldion's suggestion, which told Elvira that he had been waiting for what he considered a suitable interval before asking formally, and that the interval he had selected was approximately 72 hours. She found this enormously endearing. The ring was a narrow gold band with a small garnet, not showy, exactly right, and he asked her standing in the kitchen of the Double M while Rosa was conspicuously absent, which was the least subtle form of privacy 2 people could arrange, and she said yes before he had entirely finished the question. Rosa came back into the kitchen 30 seconds later, with an expression of profound satisfaction that she had clearly been preparing for some time. They were married in the Redemption Church on the 14th of March, 1879, on a day when the Texas sky was the clean, hard blue of early spring, and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to think about leafing out. Clara Hutchins, who had covered every significant social event in Redemption for 12 years, wrote a description of the wedding for the Gazette that was approximately 3 times longer than any wedding announcement she had previously published, and which she defended, when Archibald Fenner raised an eyebrow, on the grounds that it was simply a more interesting wedding than most. Sheriff Briggs and Mrs. Aldion sat together in the second pew. Cal and me sat with Rosa, who cried with magnificent openness and made no apology for it. Ptolemy, who had followed them to the church and could not be persuaded to leave, waited outside the door with the patience of a dog who understood the situation and considered it resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Elvira wore a dress of ivory cotton that she and me had made together over 3 weeks of focused work, with small pearl buttons down the back that had come from a catalog out of St. Louis, and which she had chosen without entirely admitting to herself that she was choosing them because they were beautiful and not merely practical. Her hair was up, with 2 small garnet pins, Jedediah's idea, to match the ring, delivered with such shy specificity that she had loved him more in that moment than she had thought was physically possible, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that grew along the creek. Jedediah in his good suit looked at her when she came down the aisle with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had stopped believing he would ever reach, and she felt, walking toward him, the particular courage of choosing something fully. The grand jury proceedings in Dallas convened in April of 1879, and Elvira traveled there with Jedediah and Marshal Rays to provide her testimony. The journey took 3 days by stage and rail, and the testimony itself took 2 days, and it was thorough and exhausting, and she gave it with the same precision and composure that she had brought to everything, the same quality that had led Marshal Rays to describe her documentation as better than a trained investigator's. Doyle Renfrew was indicted on 12 counts of federal fraud in connection with the falsification of homestead claims. The indictment included, at Marshal Rays's insistence, a separate count specifically related to the intimidation of a federal witness, Elvira, which carried its own substantial penalties. Cord Garvey testified for the prosecution and was granted a reduced charge in exchange, which was imperfect but practical, and his testimony corroborated and extended Elvira's at several crucial points. The trial was set for September. Renfrew hired the best lawyers in San Antonio and submitted motions that delayed things until October and then November, and then the following February, because that is how justice moved in 1879 and Elvira had warned herself to expect it. But the case did not collapse. The documentation was too complete, the corroborating testimony too solid, the federal interest too firm. In the meantime, 2 things happened that both mattered enormously. The first was a letter from the Federal Land Commissioner's office, addressed to Elvira at the M, informing her that the ongoing review of fraudulent claims connected to the Renfrew case had resulted in the restoration of title to 4 additional parcels of land, including the Carter family's land. The letter included a brief note from the commissioner himself, saying that the persistence of the original reporting had made the extended review possible. She sat on the porch with Ptolemy and read this letter 3 times, and the 3rd time she was not entirely composed, and Jedediah came out and found her and read it over her shoulder and sat down beside her and put his arm around her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The second thing was the discovery, in early June, that she was expecting their first child. She told Jedediah on an evening when the summer heat had finally broken slightly, and they were sitting on the porch after dinner, with the first bearable breeze in weeks moving across the flats. She had been holding the knowledge for 3 days, confirming it in her own mind, getting used to the size of it before saying it out loud. He went very still when she told him, and then he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not the quiet warmth of the evenings or the contained humor of the mornings, but something much more open, enormous, almost luminous. "Truly," was what he said. "Truly," she said. He took her face in his hands with tremendous gentleness and kissed her forehead, and then her temple and then her mouth, and held her for a long time after, and she could feel his heartbeat against her shoulder, steady and rapid, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the stars came out above the M spread, and it was enough. Rosa learned the news the following morning, and experienced what could only be described as a profound spiritual satisfaction, taking it as confirmation of a worldview she had been maintaining for years, and which she had never doubted, but was glad to have empirically verified. She began planning the necessary preparations immediately, with a focus and organizational competence that Elvira recognized and deeply respected. Cal shook Jedediah's hand with a particular firmness and said "good" in the way that Cal said things, meaning approximately 17 times what the word appeared to contain. The summer was a good one. The cattle operation ran well. The ranch was alive with the particular productive energy of a place with a clear purpose and people who believed in it. Elvira adapted the household accounts to the new complexities of a growing enterprise, because she had, with Jedediah's enthusiastic agreement, expanded Fenner's original arrangement into a full management of the ranch's finances, which had been adequately handled but never optimized, and she had found in the first 6 months 3 areas where reorganization had saved the operation a meaningful amount of money. She rode when she still could, in the early mornings, out to the southern pasture along the creek, and the yellow autumn of the cottonwoods came again, and she thought about the year that had passed with the kind of disbelief that good fortune sometimes produces, the feeling of looking at your own life and finding it almost unrecognizable in the best possible way. In November, Doyle Renfrew was convicted on 9 of the 12 counts and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The intimidation count added 2 more years. He would serve time at a federal facility in Kansas, far from the political connections that had sheltered him for so long. His ranch and associated properties were ordered sold, with a portion of the proceeds directed into a restitution fund for the families he had defrauded. Imperfect justice, still, but more justice than had seemed likely at any point in the preceding 3 years. Marshal Ray sent her a telegram that read, "Conviction secured. Your documentation was essential. Federal court thanks you." Jedediah read it over her shoulder and said, "He has no idea how much of an understatement that is." She folded the telegram carefully and put it in the cedar box she kept under her side of their bed, where she kept important papers. Their son was born on the 3rd of December, 1879, at the Double M Ranch, in the room with the east-facing window, delivered with great competence by the town doctor, a young woman named Dr. Frances Aldgate, who had recently set up practice in redemption to the initial skepticism and eventual grateful respect of its residents. Rosa was present throughout, performing the dual function of practical assistant and moral support with her characteristic efficiency. Jedediah paced the porch for 4 hours in the December cold until Rosa opened the bedroom door and told him, with the expression of a person delivering news they have been anticipating with complete certainty, that he had a son. They named the boy Thomas, after Elvira's father. Thomas Malone entered the world with a strong voice and a clear opinion about the inconvenience of having just been born, and settled within the hour into a watchful, calm attentiveness that his parents both recognized and which Jedediah said, the first time he held him, looked familiar in the most wonderful possible way. The winter was a good one. The house that had been quiet was quiet in a different way now, punctuated by Thomas, who turned out to be a person with considerable personality for someone who had not yet learned to walk. Ptolemy transferred his allegiance from Elvira to Thomas within approximately 48 hours of Thomas's arrival, positioning himself at permanent sentry near the cradle, with an expression of solemn responsibility that made everyone who visited the house slightly emotional. Clara Hutchins, who came to meet Thomas in early January with a jar of preserves and a barely concealed personal delight, looked around the kitchen where Elvira was nursing coffee and Jedediah was working at the table on the spring cattle plan, and Ptolemy was guarding the cradle and Rosa was doing something complicated with a pot that smelled extraordinary, and said, with the directness of a woman who wrote for a newspaper and believed in accurate reporting, "This is the most reassuring room in redemption." Elvira looked up from her coffee and caught Jedediah's eye across the table and saw him smile, that full, unmanaged smile that she had not seen until the autumn evening when she laughed on the porch, and which she had since come to understand was hers, specifically, to produce. And she thought that this was the precise moment she would return to, years from now, when she wanted to locate the exact coordinates of happiness. Spring came to the Texas flats with its usual extravagance. Thomas learned to hold his head up and to recognize his father's voice, and to perform a smile that was scientifically proven, by the unanimous verdict of everyone who encountered it, to be the most affecting smile in Comanche County. The cottonwoods leafed out along the creek. The grass came back in the southern pasture. The horses were let out from the winter corrals into the spring paddocks, and moved with the explosive joy of animals reclaiming their natural range. Jedediah and Elvira began talking in the evenings about expanding the homestead, not the ranch acreage, which was already substantial, but the house itself, which was comfortable but which had rooms that could be converted and a second story that could be added, and which would need to accommodate a family that both of them hoped, in the quiet shorthand of 2 people who had decided to want the same things, would not stop at 1. In May, A letter arrived from San Antonio. It was from a woman Elvira had never met, named Martha Carter, daughter of the Carter family whose land had been restored. The letter said, simply and with a directness that Elvira recognized as the dignity of a person who knew exactly what they were saying, "I found your name in the commissioner's files. I wanted you to know that we are on our land. The harvest last autumn was good. My father says we owe you something we cannot repay. I think maybe we could just say thank you and mean it completely." Elvira wrote back. The correspondence continued. Martha Carter was 24 years old, a woman of considerable intelligence and even more considerable determination, and the letters between them had the quality of a friendship finding itself. Two women who understood something about the cost of doing what was right, who had arrived at a place of stability through different routes, but recognized the terrain in each other. The summer of 1880 was a full one. The Double M ran its best cattle season in 5 years. Elvira's financial management of the operation had, over the course of a year and a half, produced results that Cal described with his characteristic understatement as not nothing, and which Jedediah described, with less understatement, as transformative. She had also, on the side and without fanfare, begun helping 3 other small ranchers and 2 farmers in the county with their accounts, on the basis that good financial management should not be available only to operations large enough to afford a dedicated bookkeeper, and that the collective financial health of the region was not unrelated to the specific financial health of the Double M. She had not stopped thinking about the land fraud case and what it represented. In August, she wrote a long formal letter to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Washington, outlining a proposal for a systematized review process for homestead claims in Texas counties with high rates of contested filings, and a suggestion for a simplified documentation requirement that would make fraudulent counterclaims more difficult to execute. She sent a copy to Clara Hutchins, who published it in the Gazette. She sent another copy to a congressman whose name she had found in the records associated with the original Renfrew case. She did not expect much. She was a ranch wife with a 9-month-old son in Comanche County, Texas. But she had also learned, definitively, that persistent paper trails made corrupt men nervous, and she saw no reason why the same principle should not apply to systemic problems as well as individual ones. Jedediah read the letter in draft form and said, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas on his knee, engaged in an intense examination of the corner of the table, that it was one of the finest pieces of policy writing he had read, and that she should send it to at least 3 more people while she was at it. She had added 2 more recipients, and he had added a third from his own contacts on the council, and the letter went out with 5 recipients instead of 2. The autumn of 1880 brought several things. Thomas began walking, with the magnificent staggering determination of a person who has decided that locomotion is entirely manageable and requires no further assistance from adults, which resulted in the relocation of approximately everything below knee height in the main house to higher positions. Ptolemy took on the unofficial role of walking companion and cushioning agent, positioning himself strategically near Thomas at all times in case a fall seemed imminent, a role he fulfilled with great seriousness. A letter came from Washington. Not from the congressman, not yet, but from a staff official in the Land Commissioner's office, who said that her proposal had been forwarded to the relevant committee and was under review, and that additional information about the specific cases she had referenced would be welcome. She provided it. The first frost came and Elvira stood at the kitchen window with a mug of Rose's coffee and watched the long light of November on the flats and thought about this time last year, Thomas newly arrived, the conviction just secured, the house full of a warmth that had seemed, after so long, almost impossible to believe. It did not seem impossible now. It seemed exactly like what it was, the real life she was living, built piece by piece from courage and honesty and the decision to sit down in an empty chair. She heard Jedediah come in from the barn, the familiar sound of his boots on the porch, the door. He came into the kitchen and she turned, and he looked at her with the particular expression she associated with the mornings, the undisguised, entirely unmanaged quality that she knew was hers. And she said, because she had confirmed it that morning with Dr. Aldgate, and had been carrying the knowledge all day like a warm secret, "We should talk about that second bedroom." His expression shifted through understanding to delight in approximately half a second. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she met him halfway, and Thomas, from his position on the sitting room floor with Ptolemy, observed this development with the equanimity of a 1-year-old who had not yet developed opinions about parental demonstrations of affection. "When?" Jedediah said, his hands on her face, his forehead against hers. "August, I think," she said. "Or September." "Rosa is going to be insufferable," he said, and she laughed, and he kissed her, and outside the November light lay long and gold across the Texas grass. Rosa was, in fact, deeply satisfied in a way that transcended insufferable and achieved the quality of vindication. And she took personal responsibility for Elvira's nutrition throughout the winter, with a focused intensity that Elvira found overwhelming and touching in equal measure. Dr. Aldgate came for a visit in February and pronounced everything in excellent order, and Jedediah asked her approximately 14 questions, with the focused concern of a man who had decided that medical information was something he needed to be fully on top of. And Dr. Aldgate answered all of them with the patience of a physician who found prepared and attentive fathers to be refreshing rather than tiresome. The second bedroom was begun in March. Cal managed the construction with the same organized efficiency he brought to everything, and by late April the room was completed, with a south-facing window and good plaster walls and a door wide enough to be practical, and it was ready in June, which was 2 months before it was needed, but which meant Jedediah could stop quietly worrying about whether it would be finished in time, and Elvira appreciated this on his behalf. Their daughter arrived on the 4th of September, 1881, with considerably less announcement than Thomas had made, and a quality of serene alertness that Rosa said reminded her of Elvira in her most composed moments, which was the highest compliment Rosa was capable of giving. They named her Clara Frances Clara for Clara Hutchins, who had become a genuine friend and who was visibly moved by the honor when informed, maintaining her composure for approximately 4 seconds before abandoning it, and Frances for Dr. Aldgate, who received the news with a pleasure that was professional in its modulation, but genuine in its depth. Thomas, who was almost 2, regarded his sister's arrival with the philosophical acceptance of a person who had been told to expect a development and was now observing it. He patted her head once with careful gentleness, decided she was acceptable, and returned to the more pressing business of following Ptolemy around the yard. The years settled into the texture of a life fully lived. Thomas grew into a serious, curious boy who inherited his mother's precision and his father's steadiness, and who could be found at any given time either helping Cal with some ranch task he had decided was entirely within his competence, or sitting on the porch with a book from his father's collection, with a look of concentrated focus that made Elvira's heart perform complicated maneuvers. Clara Frances was, from the earliest possible age, a person of strong opinions and considerable charm, the kind of child who makes everyone around her slightly more alive, and she and Ptolemy formed an alliance of mutual devotion that lasted for the whole of Ptolemy's long and well-treated life. In the summer of 1883, the congressman from Washington, the one Elvira had written to in 1880, visited Redemption as part of a tour of Western territories to review land management practices. He met with Elvira at the Double M, with Jedediah present and Thomas underfoot and Clara Frances asleep in the next room, and they talked for 3 hours. The congressman was a decent man who had been genuinely persuaded by her original letter, and who had been waiting for the opportunity to discuss its implications directly. 6 months later, A revised protocol for homestead claim review in disputed counties was incorporated into a federal administrative update that largely implemented the approach she had outlined. Clara Hutchins ran a front-page story in the Gazette. She used the word landmark. Archibald Fenner, who still employed Elvira for his accounts on a reduced basis even though she had long since moved to the ranch, came into the Silver Spur to show the newspaper to Pete and anyone else who happened to be present. Sheriff Briggs read it and said, "Figured," in the tone of a man whose estimation of someone had been confirmed rather than revised. Jedediah read the story at the breakfast table with Thomas leaning over his shoulder to look at the newspaper and said, when he had finished, "Your father would have been proud." She had to take a moment with that. Then she said, "Yes, I think he would have been." "You are also allowed to be proud of yourself," he said, in the gently direct way he said things when he meant them seriously. She looked at him across the table, this face she knew completely now, the silver more established at the temples, the lines deeper, the gray-green eyes unchanged, and thought about a woman arriving on a stage with a carpetbag and a secret and $37, and no idea what was waiting for her in a town called Redemption. "I am," she said. "I am proud of myself." He smiled at her and reached across the table and took her hand, and Thomas made a face of theatrical 7-year-old disgust at the parental display. And Clara Frances, who had come in from the yard at some point and was now standing in the kitchen doorway watching, said, with the satisfaction of a 2-year-old who approves of what she is seeing, "Good." The Silver Spur was rebuilt in 1884 after a fire that started in the kitchen and burned through 2 walls before it was contained. The new establishment was larger and better ventilated and had a properly paved floor instead of packed earth, and Pete, who had been promoted from barkeep to owner by the previous proprietor, who had retired to San Antonio, had designed it with the particular vision of a man who knew exactly what a good social establishment required. The corner table survived the fire. Pete had carried it out himself during the chaotic first minutes when it was unclear how bad the damage would be, and he had been mildly embarrassed about this priority when asked about it later, and not very embarrassed at all when pressed. It was restored to its position in the new establishment in exactly the same corner, with the same 2 chairs, and everything about it was exactly as it had always been. Elvira and Jedediah came in on the morning of the reopening and sat at the corner table for the first time in several years. They had, over the years, grown into the habit of drinking their morning coffee on the ranch porch, with the spread stretching out before them in the early light, which was preferable to any saloon, and Pete brought them coffee without being asked, as he always had. And Jedediah picked up a copy of the Gazette, and Elvira opened her current book, and they sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have been filling the same space for years, and have made it entirely their own. Clara Frances, who was 3, sat in a 3rd chair that had been added by someone with the appropriate foresight, and ate a piece of the sweet bread that Rosa had sent with them for this purpose, and looked around the Silver Spur with the assessing expression of a person who was deciding what she thought about this. "I like it," she announced finally, to no one in particular. "Good," said Pete, refilling Jedediah's coffee, and that settled that. The Double M spread continued to grow and thrive. In 1885, Jedediah began working with 3 neighboring ranchers to establish a regional cattle association that could negotiate collectively with the rail buyers in Fort Worth, which had been a consistent problem for smaller operations for years. The buyers played individual ranchers against each other, and the prices suffered accordingly. Elvira handled the financial and organizational structure of the association with the same focused clarity she brought to everything, and the first collective negotiation with the Fort Worth buyers in the spring of 1886 produced rates that were a third better than anything the independent ranchers had managed the previous year. Cal said this was not nothing. The 3 neighboring ranchers said considerably more, with considerably more warmth, over a dinner at the Double M at which Rosa outdid herself and Jedediah played the guitar after, which had become the traditional conclusion to any significant celebration at the ranch, and which the children had grown up understanding to mean that something good had happened and the evening deserved marking. Thomas, at 8, had started learning the guitar himself. He had his father's patience and a musical instinct that was his own, and on the evenings when they played together on the porch, Jedediah on the right, Thomas on the left, Clara Frances sitting between them with Ptolemy's successor, a young cattle dog named Archimedes who had similar personality traits, curled at her feet. Elvira would sit in her chair and listen and feel something so full and complete that she had no word for it in any language she had studied, only the physical fact of it. Warm and permanent in her chest. In the autumn of 1886, Martha Carter came to visit. She had been corresponding with Elvira for 6 years, and this was the first time they had met in person. And the recognition they felt was immediate, the recognition of two people who have known each other through letters long enough that the person is already fully real before you see their face. Martha was a tall, direct-eyed woman of 30 with a farmer's hands and a scholar's vocabulary, and a quality of groundedness that Elvira associated with people who had survived serious things and come out knowing exactly who they were. She stayed for 2 weeks. She helped with the fall accounts. She played cards with Clara Hutchins and argued cheerfully with her about the coverage of farming versus cattle interests in the Gazette. She taught Thomas a card trick that Cal considered inadvisable to teach an 8-year-old, which was probably correct, but which Thomas found delightful. She and Elvira talked every evening after the children were in bed about the land, about the families who had gotten it back and the ones who had not, about what remained to be done, about the long, slow machinery of change and how to engage with it without being destroyed by impatience. "You saved my family's land," Martha said one evening without preamble, in the way she said things. "The legal system saved it," Elvira said. "I just gave it the right information." "That is the same thing," Martha said, "when the system is not looking for the right information on its own." Elvira thought about this for a moment. "I suppose it is," she said. When Martha left, she and Elvira agreed to meet annually. This happened every year without interruption, alternating between Texas and the Carter farm in the hill country south of Austin, and the correspondence between them continued for the rest of their lives. The years after were the years of the life filling in completely. Thomas grew into a young man with his mother's precision and his father's quiet authority, who went east for 2 years to study at the Agricultural College in Austin, and came back with ideas about soil management and water conservation that revolutionized the Double M's southwestern pastures, and once shared through the Cattle Association, improved outcomes for ranchers across the county. He came back with a young woman named Helen, a botanist's daughter from Austin who had her own strong opinions and her own careful intelligence, and who had sat through a very thorough assessment by Rosa, the most demanding judge of character on the ranch, and emerged with a clear approval rating and a standing invitation to Sunday dinner. Thomas and Helen were married in the Redemption Church in April of 1897, and Elvira stood beside Jedediah during the ceremony and held his hand and thought about standing in that same church herself 18 years before, and about the road that had run between then and now, and found it impossible to wish a single thing about it different. Clara Frances was 14 by then, in the formidable stage of development that meant she had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them, which Jedediah handled with the equanimity of a man who had known from the beginning that this child was going to be exactly this way and had been quietly preparing for years. She was reading everything in the house, running out of available books, and had developed the habit of borrowing from Clara Hutchins's substantial collection in exchange for helping to typeset the Gazette 2 afternoons a week, which meant she was also learning the newspaper trade by osmosis, a development that Clara Hutchins regarded with unconcealed pleasure. The Silver Spur continued to be the center of Redemption's social life, and the corner table continued to be occupied by Elvira and Jedediah on the mornings they came into town, which was perhaps twice a week by the mid-1890s. Pete had married a woman named June who had come out from Ohio to take up a teaching position at the school, and they had 2 daughters who treated the Silver Spur as a secondary home and who had learned, from some cultural transmission that no one had explicitly arranged, that the corner table was not available for other people. On the morning of their 20th wedding anniversary, Jedediah and Elvira sat at the corner table in the Silver Spur, and Pete brought them coffee and a piece of the cake that Rosa had sent with elaborate instructions about how it was to be served. And the morning light of March came in through the windows of the saloon and lay in long bars across the floor, and it was quiet except for the familiar sounds of the town waking up outside. Jedediah looked at the second chair, at Elvira in the second chair, as he had looked at it empty for years before she had arrived, and she saw the expression on his face and knew exactly what he was thinking. 20 years, she said. 20 years, he agreed. And then, with the smile that was entirely hers, the full and unmanaged one, "It is still exactly where it belongs." She reached across the table and took his hand, and the morning of Redemption, Texas, in the year 1899 went about its business around them, and the cottonwoods along the creek were greening up for spring, and somewhere at the ranch Thomas was checking the south pasture fencing, and Clara Frances was writing something in her notebook with ferocious concentration, and Archimedes II was performing his appointed rounds of the yard, and everything was exactly as it should be. There are some stories that are about escape, and some that are about arrival, and some that are about the long, difficult middle distance between the two. Elvira Ramsey's story was all 3, and it was also something more specific than any category. It was about the kind of courage that does not announce itself, that sits quietly across a table from the truth and refuses to look away. It was about a dark past not as a wound to be concealed, but as a history to be owned, and about what it looks like when honesty and decency find each other in a Texas saloon on an ordinary morning and recognize what was always meant to be. It was about an empty chair, and the woman it had always belonged to, and the man who had been watching it long enough to know. In the end, which was also simply the continuation of the middle, they were 2 people who had both been carrying more than they should have carried alone and had set it down together, the grief, the secrets, the hidden motives of a world that had tried to use them both in different ways, and had found that what remained when you set all of that down was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The Redemption Gazette, in a profile that Clara Hutchins wrote for the paper's 30th anniversary edition in 1900, described Elvira Malone as the woman who changed how Texas handles its homestead records, and who also, if you ask the right people, makes the best financial argument in 3 counties. Jedediah, when asked for a comment, had said simply that she had sat in a chair that had been waiting for her, and that was all there was to say, and everything there was to say about the whole of it. He was right, as he generally was about the things that mattered. The chair stayed in the corner of the Silver Spur until Pete's daughters took over the establishment in 1908 and refurbished it, at which point they moved the chair on the reasoning that some things should be preserved, to the Double M Ranch, where it lived on the porch beside the chair that had always been Jedediah's. Clara Frances, by then 25 and working as a journalist for the Austin Daily Statesman, and writing letters home every week that Elvira kept in the cedar box alongside the federal marshal's telegram, and the letter from Martha Carter and everything else she considered essential, had been the one to suggest the relocation. She had a clear sense of what deserved to be kept. The 2 chairs sat on the Double M porch for many years after that, side by side, facing east to catch the morning light, which was where they had always been heading.